So, für heute haben wir es bald geschafft.
Okay, we're almost done for today.
25 Minuten sind eingeplant.
We have 25 minutes for this last presentation of the day. We already used up a minute and a half. So the topic that we picked for this last presentation of the day is more special here because it's very, very interesting, it's very fun, and that's why I just also took a little bit more time for it. That's the new Metrik-System. So what is this all about? This is really about data processing. So the question is always, is it red, green, not blue, but is it okay or not, really? That's what it comes down. What's the situation? But since we check on systems on a regular basis, that's why we really do that. CPU, for example, usage, and data system and so on, how much that's being used. So it's very neutral in the beginning, and then with this data you can actually work quite a bit. You can analyze problems later on because it always says it's the network's problem. So that's why we can check, is that really the network's problem, what was going on, and so on. And you can also say, well, I'm going to look at what is happening, you know, how much you actually saved, and you can see, well, do I have a week left until it's full, and so on. So those are just easy examples. In the future, we want to think even further here. So what we want to do is we want to change the word how Checkmk and specifically really deals with this metric system, and we want to specialize a little bit more. So we are talking about performance data here. So this term historically is something that says CPU, and utilization has something to do with performance. But the number of logged in users and the bandwidth that is being used in percentage is not only necessarily something to do with performance. That's why we talk about metrics here. That's why we are using this exactly. So we now have a new system to really deal with these metrics, and it's made up of two parts. So that's really recording them and then visualizing them. So actually recording them, that is something that we've done with the microcore on a new basis here. So we went away from that, how PNP Vanagios works. So that's long step with different spools and so on until it's in the R&Ds. And this has been now changed with a microcore because now they communicate directly. So that really means that we now have a good way to have the data in that R&D tool. So the saving system here is still the R&D tool. That works well, and Oettinger and partner, Toby and Manu, are also Checkmk partner. We work together closely, and we're very happy about that because we now have integration in our minicore because of that. And then the second part here is visualization. So the PNP Vanagios is using the graphic fronting from R&D tool, and that really does pixel pictures here, and they are very, very strict, so that you can't do much on an interactive level here. And that's why we said we want to take step by step and modernize it, and we need a modern HTML5 surface. So in addition to that, with the new metric system, we also solve a few more problems here. So I have a few key terms here that I noted down for you. So one of the problems, for example, is the one that we used to use up until now. Then if you have a graph from the remote sites and you want to show them, you need HTTP. And the reason for that is that the performance database is on the monitoring side. That is very important that that is the case because of the scaling. I don't want all monetary information moving all over all the time. So as soon as you have the graph, what happened up until now, that the picture was being created and then it was going to through HTTP to the website, but then you also needed another connection in addition to live status. That was then difficult for configuration, for performance, and so on. So now what we did is we now have the performance raw data being streamed via live status. So the microcore on the remote side can now have the live status and can then look into the R&Ds And because of that, we have the round-robin libraries. And with that, we can then look at it from the live status and then send it to the central point. So I can say, give me the service, and then from date X to Y, the following metrics. So that is very good, and I don't need another data channel. In addition to that, with the new system, it's a lot easier to create graph templates. Who has used TMT templates before, or to create them or change them? It's not that easy. I'm going to show you an example in a little bit. In addition to that, we also have the purple meters. That's the colorful ones where you can see a value right away, and that is also included in the new system. And in addition to that, if we have all that, so as of today, we also have plans for the future of what's to come. And because it's all cleaned up now, we now can do so much more in the future. And of course, in addition to that, it should also look good. Okay, so let's look at the graph rendering here. This is a very classical situation here. That's PNP for Nagios. That's not really true. It's a Robin tool, really. And then you get a graph definition that is being put together by PNP for Nagios, and then you get R&D commands, and that's how you get this graph. So this is a very easy, universal process here. And also, it's not as interactive anymore, and also I'm a little bit limited in terms of looks here. And that's why we have exactly the same thing here, but it is an HTML5 graph. So this is the HTML canvas. Who knows HTML canvas 5? Does anybody know about that? So what we do is we draw vector graphs here, and we can use this graph, and then we can have it in our reporting PDF, and we don't lose any quality here. So in reporting, that really is not a picture anymore, but it is a vector graphic native in the PDF. So you can really use the PDF in order to draw lines and so on. And that's why this is really, really good in terms of looks. So there are a lot of small things that we optimized here. You can see that here the descriptions, for example, all the graphs now have a description. They are very unanimous here. With the templates, it always depends on whoever created it, sometimes on top, sometimes on the bottom, and so on. It's very systematic here. So you have a table of metrics here, and they are underneath each other in different colors. And then you have min, max, average, first, and last. So that's always the same. You can also tell that in this case, if you see the values here, if you look at the values, it's megabytes here, and that's also very intelligent scaling here, because that adapts automatically, always depending on the size. I'm going to give you some more information a little bit on that. So this is the comparison again. So looking at it from far away, it looks very similar, but if you look closer, it is very, very different. It's just nicer. Okay, then we have real vector graphics here. We have intelligent labeling here, as I mentioned before. So if you, for example, have different things, for example, volts, you can always scale all that. If we talk about byte, for example, you can really say it's 1,000. 1,000 is not the factor, but 1,024 kilobytes, megabytes, and so on. So you can't really tell in this picture, but then it just chooses different steps here, so whatever you're used to. And then there are also axes here. Who's ever seen an uptime graph in old Checkmk? It says 300 millidays, for example. That's pretty funny. It's true. But it might also not have anything to do with the RD tool, but maybe the template is just not good enough. But then you kind of have to really think about what does that mean in minutes. And the new graphic system knows that it's time and then actually makes it where it's minutes and hours and seconds and so on, whatever is appropriate. Also, the biggest difference here is it's interactive, and I can touch it with my mouse. I can move it around. I can zoom in and so on. I'm going to show you more pictures here as well. So you can zoom in terms of time, horizontally as well. That's a very important one that PNP doesn't have. And if I'm not interested in this top part, but I want to look at the bottom, then I can just zoom in and make it bigger. That wasn't possible for PNP because you could only scale time. So that is very special here too. You can look at the whole graph and just make the whole picture and the whole window bigger. Okay, so the graph templates, how do I define my own template if I program to check myself? Let's take the example of PNP. It's a little small, I know. We have the CPU load that is not that complex, at least that's what you would assume. But this is just big enough for one size. If we look at the network interfaces, for example, that's from Checkmk. So this is the definition here, the definition of the graph. And if you have a new check, that's not very fun here, because then it's just being copied, changed a little bit, but it's just not fun. And what we do, or what we have done with Checkmk, we have... You're laughing because it looks so complicated, but it's really not. So a check can give you a value, for example. Let's look at this, for example. It's very, very interesting what kind of unit it is in this case. So what they say is that we just have to differentiate it. It has all to be very much defined, and then we just define how we want to draw them. But there's really two different things. So what we say at first, there is something that we need, Bolt, for example, that has a title as well. So here it's electrical tension. That's something that's very international here. You can also use the German word for it. And then we also have a function that actually deals with it. So a physical precision 3, for example, that means it's 0.321, so that can be 12 millivolts, for example. And again, that's where the little letters come from, and that's very, very, very precise because it's 2 or 3 units here. So that's a unit that has a title, and it also has a function that has a value and represents a value in this case. So we have a whole range of definitions that is already done, and you can just use them, and very rarely you have to actually make a new one. There are bytes per minute and second and so on, all kinds of units here. So in addition to that, there are where there is a check plugin. Let's have a look at the next slide first. If we have values from a check, you wrote a check and that really gives you perf data here, then with the new metric system you say the base is always supposed to be 1. So one says kilobyte, the next one says byte, and so on. So it's very, very confusing. So I really can't really calculate with this data later on. So with a template, then that is something you have to consider, because we said you have to really have one solution that fits all. So the check is always with base 1. And if that's not the case, then we have to recalculate that. For example, times are always in seconds, not minutes, days, or anything, but it's always 6. And bytes are being used, for example, for sizes. And then currents is always in ampere. And so it's really, really clear what it is. If that is not the case in one point in time, then what I can do is I can then use an existing check, and then I can define it. This one, for example, memory, for example, because it is an already existing check, it really gives the data in megabytes. So the metric system is then recalculating it, is adjusting it before it does anything else. So in that template, I really don't have to deal with that at all, whether or not it was megabytes or bytes or whatever it was. That happens automatically. So if you develop new checks, this is really what happens. You don't have to define it anymore. But for the existing ones, we actually dealt with that as well, so now it works. And now you can also rename a variable here. That makes sense. I'm going to show you that in a second. Okay, we already looked at this slide. Okay, if I... Let me see. I think I'm missing one slide here, but it doesn't matter. So just going to skip this. I'm missing a slide here, so I'm sorry, but we defined a unit, a translation here, and what I don't have as a slide is what we say is that each performance variable is being defined by what it means. So let's consider memory used here. That's a name. And I say, well, that is being the unit is byte, it's a color, and it's the memory, for example. Then I have a declaration of this metric. If then some kind of check then uses underscore use, then the metric system knows, aha, this is in byte, and this is always going to be purple, for example. So then it really doesn't matter. The one just gives you swap, for example, or whatever it is. It really doesn't matter then. So how it is defined, the check type in terms of templates, that really doesn't exist. The check just says, well, I have these values I measure in, and the metric system knows, aha, I know this. This is the title it has. This is the color it has, and that is the way you can then relatively easily I either draw graphs or performeters. So let's look at the definition of a performeter. I'm declaring here that I have a type, for example, a logarithmic one. So this is what it's called. In this case, it's this one. And I'm saying that in the middle of the performeter, the value is 0.1. And we know that's milliseconds. So it's 0.1 seconds because RTA is the time. And exponent 4 means that all 10% are times 4. So at 50%, I have 100 milliseconds. At 60%, I have 400, and so on. So if there is one check plugin that really needs that RTA variable, then this performeter is actually showing up. Who has actually tried to program a performeter before? That's not that easy. So now it is easy. It never used to be easy in the past. But let's look at a linear performeter. As an example, for a linear performeter, I can have several different segments next to each other. In this case, it's an example. I say type is linear. It can have several different segments. In this case, for example, the memory here in percentage, the used memory in percentage, and then we have the notation here that you all know. I have 100, I have the used memory percentage here, and then I subtract that. I do that in this color, and that's why the right-hand side is not white, but it's light green, for example. So I can say the max value is 100, and then I can also label it. So this is just an example, but I can also calculate with the performeter here. So the value that I want to represent, if it's not 1-to-1 out of the tool, then I can actually recalculate it too. Okay, let's look at an example of a graph definition. So what we saw earlier is in this case a little bit simpler. So the most important one is the declaration metrics here. What I say is that I want the metrics load 1 and load 15, and load 1 is supposed to be the area and load 15 is supposed to be the line. And the colors were already defined earlier because load 1 is already blue, and that is also a number. So that's why I really just have to list it here. Here, if I want to, I can use warning crit. And I don't see that right now because it's all the way on the top right now because it's scaled, of course. So this is the max value, and that's default. And I can also fill in the title here. This is also how you can calculate that, and also you can put in the number of cores. So this is a little bit of a complex template here, but if you just look at that, it's just pretty small, and it's a pretty short description. If I now have a check and that actually has load 1 and load 15, then automatically I get this graph. So I don't really have to do anything for that. If I have a check plugin that is really taking advantage of the already existing metric, that's really what happens. So then I just have to make sure that load 1 really does mean the same thing. Okay, in this case I also have an example of a graph that's showing a swap. We have total swap, swap used, area and stack. I can put them on top of each other, and then the colors were already defined with metrics, and then this is exactly what pops up automatically. So this makes it a lot easier for us in order to define the graphs, and also for you, of course, if you have your own plugin and you want to develop your own plugin. So the colors are taken from metrics definitions here. I'm going to show you another one in a little bit. And the labeling is happening automatically. And there are additional features that PMP can do. I can, for example, say if there's 0 metrics, for example, then it can be dropped. I don't even want to see the curve at all. So that happens. There is a check that can actually do that CPD connections here. There are 15 different statuses, so many different ones. And now I can say I just really want to see the ones that are actually there. And that makes it a little bit easier, of course. In addition to that, I can also really make them calculated. So if I want this curve plus this curve plus this curve, then that can actually be calculated. And then I only see the result from my remote side. So generally, we can say that the data that I need to collect is smaller than it was before, because before I had to get the whole picture, and now I just need some values here, and that actually makes it a lot easier. So how are graphs assigned to checks? So the check actually gives you performance variables. So the graph needs performance variables in these metrics, and if everything the graph needs is actually there, then it can be drawn. That's very easy. That can happen with multiple ones, and that actually works. Okay, so this is really the whole idea behind it. Tomorrow we are going to look at what's to come in the future, and what I would like to do now is, it's almost 6 o'clock, but I would like to show you, if I can actually do that, a live example. Let me see if I can actually open this monitoring system. I have the Checkmk value 1, a very new one yesterday, which I installed yesterday. And it's very simple. The problem is that I probably don't have any interesting values here, but let me see. Not sure how good the connection here is in the hotel, but can you see that? Let me see. Let me try to sync it. Okay, now you can see it. So this is the demo site here, and let's just use any graph here. For example, let me see which one is actually shows some movement here. Let's use this one. Okay, this is exactly the graph we had so far. Let me see, this was not updated. We wanted to do that, but it's the old version. Damn it. Let's try the local side again. So that's my test machine. Of course, the problem here is that I didn't collect a lot of data here. The problem is that this machine has only been running for a minute. But what we can see here is that I can actually move it around with my mouse here, and you can sort of separate it here, but there's only one value in here. Of course, that's a little bit of a problem here. I can change the size. Excuse me? Yeah, so let's just try it out at home then. It's in there for quite a few months already. It's almost complete here, and in order to have this complete, if I click on these sides here, I'm still at the classical PMP. It still exists, but we are going to replace them with our own page so that we can do it without the PPO site. Another thing here that's nice to know as well, what you can do now, the new graphs here, you can actually put them in a collection. What I can say is, please attach it here to my graphs, for example, and then if I do that, I have my graph collection right here. Oh, I know this one too, yeah. That just came in, and then what you have here is just a snapshot of yesterday, for example. So I can just have several different graphs here in my graph collection, and then just, access them at any time. Do we have a microphone for Sasha?
Das war ein Pult.
When I have the collections, can I have different graphs as well? Can I connect them? Something like temperature graphs and data, for example, and so on. Can I do that so that I can really see? Yes, you can actually combine different graphs in this collection. Also clusters. So if I say all my web servers here, and also, if I work with regex, for example, no, you would do that with the metric search time graphs, this section here. You can then look for the graphs that you have with all these different attributes here, and then you can save it as a bookmark, for example. So that's a more dynamic view here. And I could also make it a report here that I just send out every Monday morning, for example. Yeah, you can do that. That's just a normal view that you can make part of the reporting. Graph collection is just more like of an ad hoc version for research, for example. If you say, I want to look at this one and this one and this one, that's really what it's for. We just saw that the graphs were very nice and they were synchronized in this view. So if you change something on the top, then it also changed on the bottom. Does that also happen with the graph search? Yes, that happens everywhere. Generally, if you are in one view and you have several graphs there, they always show the same period in time. So as soon as I choose something here, you can see that all graphs do the same thing. So that actually makes sense then, because you always want to look at a specific point in time, so they're all synchronized here. It takes a little bit, but that's due to the performance here, because just imagine you have 50 graphs and one on your screen here. So when you're searching, it's the same thing? Yes, it's exactly the same thing. We can try it out if you want. I'm just going to do that. I'm just going to try something out in GIMP snapshot here, but I'm very daring here. So let's look at all services starting with CPU. Okay, that was only one. Let's look for all graphs, for example. And then, of course, it should also be the case here. If I do that, you can see that it's also moving with it, right along with it. So I don't actually have a mouse here, but it's actually also happening here. So you can just do research very easily. That could actually take a little while, but this is just because I'm trying to prove something here. I don't know how many graphs are right here. This is a little small, but well, we are definitely going to fix that if it's not working yet, but it's just a little bit script magic here. Can you have the defined colors? Can you actually change them if it actually doesn't match? Well, you're talking about the second step here. The first step is exactly this, and then the second step has not been completed yet, but it's going to be the case that you can actually adapt the graph templates, not only the colors, but you can also say, I also want to see this curve, or I don't want to see this curve, and so on. And then the third one is freeform graphs. So you can say in one graph, I want all my web servers on top of each other. So then tomorrow I'm going to talk about that on my roadmap. You said that the performance data is not going there via live status, so I can really have the live status carry language and get my performance data. And then the RD database is that's where it's being extracted here, so I really have the same detail as it is in the database. So that really is the case. Do you have any plans to make this available for reporting as well, so that you don't only import the graph for it, but you can also have a performance report? Yes, that's also part of our roadmap. Performance data is not only a graph for time, really, but what I want to do is, for example, if you want to know I have a pool of 100 web servers or 100 ESX hosts, and I would like to know the top 10 that really use the most performance was last month. Then you can just look at the last month, and you can just want to know the average CPU usage, and then you want that in a number as a table. So I don't extract a curve, but I extract numbers here. So that's what we're planning on, but it's not implemented yet. We have done something like that 2 years ago for one of our customers. We actually did that, and we actually had to have access to the R&D database and so on. And do you have any idea when that's going to happen for you? No, we don't actually have a time frame here, because it also depends on our customers and our orders, of course, because concrete orders are definitely coming before what we are planning on doing. But of course, next year we definitely want to take a step forward here. So the normal performance data is something you can actually look at right now, but not the scale values. You can just say, I want from here to here, and then you can also use the Robin tool, and then you actually get a column 4 service here, and then you get directly, if you have the Python, for example, it's a list of floats you get, and for JSON it's also a list, and for CSV it's just the values separated with commas. So you can just send one request, the service status, and 3 metrics. So that's very simple. I just have a quick question. With the new metrics, can you also already do trends? Well, we could probably do that with ID tools, but it's not included as of right now. But of course, it's supposed to come. That's going to happen, because we want that in our template definition to have complex values like that. For file systems, there is a graph for a trend that is already calculated from Check, so that's a very normal metric. But having a trend in the graph itself, that's not implemented yet. Do I need the microcore for that, or can I also do that with scenarios and the live status model? Right now, you really do need the microcore for that. It's not really sure if Narius is also going to have that support, but as of right now, we only have the microcore with the libair, and that wasn't easy, and that really has the direct access to performance data. So for Naquist, does that also have the new Metrik-System included, so that I have Naquist and I can look at the metrics there as well? Lars, can you actually answer that? Okay, so Naquist itself, the integration is not 100% yet. You can't just click it on so far. But since we render with JavaScript, it's probably going to be a lot more work than just having the pictures from PMP and including them. But I think we still have some more work to do here in order for that to really work. But I think by next conference, that's going to work. But Lars, isn't there a web service that can actually show those graphs for pop-ups? Yeah, that's true, but the problem is probably the integration to Naquist here, depending on where you want to actually show it. So I think if it's an iframe in the map, or also hover menus, it probably works. And in a diff, you can't do that. If I just say, if it's just right here, if I hover over this, then it's already there. Well, the problem is that you really have to have the whole Checkmk and JavaScript code, and you have to really have all that in Naquist, and I think that could be difficult. I'm not sure if that could actually work, but if you have it in a frame, then it definitely can work. Okay, so that's just some technical details we have to actually resolve here, and then it's going to work. But next year we'll definitely have it. The metric, I can also use it on an external website. So that means if I have an overview, for example, from IT, so an internal intranet site from IT, and I have certain values there that I want to see, for example, ESX usage and so on, can I also do that with iframe? That's a good question. It's probably the same as Naquist. We haven't tried it yet, but technically it wouldn't be a problem. But there's also this web service that does the pop-up here. And the question is really here in the detail. Do we really have the right JavaScript files and so on? I have a question too. So did I just understand that all temperature graphs, regardless of which source, they all look the same and they all have the same color? You just asked that question, so I can answer yes. And did I also understand you correctly? If I have a new check that gives me a variable that knows the metric, then everything else happens by itself, the graphs, the parameters, and so on, all this happens by itself? Yes, that's true. I am going to try to show you an example. So maybe that's too much into detail, but it's true, yes. So if your check really knows the performance values, and then it does work, yes. Unless the metric wasn't declared before, and then you do need the declaration here. But if your check gives you temperature, and then it says DMP, and then you also name the Celsius, and then it's already done. Okay, if there aren't any more questions, then I would like to ask Sven to give us some organizational details here. Thank you very much for your attention.